Welcome, everybody, to the 85th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest to the show, Professor Laura Lieber.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Okay, so for those less familiar here with Professor Lieber, she is a professor of religious studies. Remind me where?
Duke University.
Duke, all right. Not a Tar Heel fan, I assume. The Blue Devils. All right.
I don't hold it against them.
Yes. All right. Blue Devils. Having earned her PhD from the University of Chicago, go Maroons, her primary area of research is in the area of synagogue poetry, piyut, from late antiquity and the Byzantine era period, examining them from a variety of perspectives, including literary, performative, and comparative, particularly with early Christian hymnography in Syriac and Greek, and also as a genre of early Jewish biblical interpretation. In recent years, Professor Lieber has begun to integrate the study of material culture into her analysis of these literary works as part of taking a more fully contextual approach to literary analysis. So that brings us to our topic today, very interestingly enough, on taverns in the Talmud, which I'm stoked. So yes. Okay. So I don't think for those people who generally do stuff with the Talmud, I don't think taverns typically come up. It's not usually at the top of people's minds. Right?
So, yeah, I mean, I can say that the article that you reference in the notes to this episode, really the genesis was a friend of mine who does work in Talmud who said, "Oh, you're working on sort of theater and performance in the liturgy. I was wondering if you could help explain this passage to me."
Really? Okay. So I think that's a great wait. I think that's a great tease. So I'm going to mention that, and then I want to circle back to that. So we don't often think about taverns in the Talmud, but I was struck by Professor Lieber's discussion of the term Kובי in her Daru in the Winehouse, the intersection of status and dance in the Jewish East, the Journal of Religion, volume 98, which was published January 2018. And so that got me thinking, because I'm familiar with the phrase Beit Mishteh, and listeners of the show may remember episode 55 of the Jewish Drinking Show, in which we discussed that term in the Mishnah and Tosefta, but it doesn't appear so much. I mean, that's a Hebrew term, but we have this term Beit Kובי in Aramaic, which only appears maybe 10-ish times in the Babylonian Talmud. So, okay. So Professor Lieber, wait, how did you get onto this topic? Like the research?
It was just I was at a conference, as academics often are, and I was talking to a friend from grad school who is far more of a Talmudist than I am. But when she found out I was working on performance and liturgy and the early synagogue and weddings and other things, she's like, "Well, maybe you can explain this passage to me, because it came up in class and I just didn't really know what to make of it." Wow. And I just sort of filed it away for a while, and then eventually, I can't even remember why, I decided to go back and take a closer look at it. And so I had a really good time. Just sort of, I developed a real affection for Daru and Rav Nachman. And
can I ask you? This is a very personal question. Has anybody pronounced it Daru?
Oh, that could be.
So when I come across the name, I'm like, Drew is a Talmudic name. It's a slave name, but a name still, nevertheless, in the Talmud.
So it is. We can do Daru.
Daru. That's as close, Talmudic name as Drew is. Okay, I had to ask.
I have. It could just be I'm giving a North Carolina inflection. I don't know.
Daru. It's it's in the ballpark. Yeah. Okay, all right. So this term. So for those less familiar, so going into what is this term even that we talk about, this tavern? So I mentioned earlier this phrase Beit Mishteh, drinking house in Tannaitic, earlier rabbinic literature, but we have this other term about 10 times, Beit Kובי, a house of casks of, right? So, yeah. So this is an interesting one, and it has really two sort of uses, very broadly speaking, right? Two usages, right? Do you want to talk about that?
I can sort of say just a little bit. One is that it appears to be a category of a facility, we might say, sort of like a tavern. It's a house of casks. So it could just be sort of a place that people would go to where all the kegs are kept, and sort of easy access to the party supplies. But it also shows up as a place name. So that's the other. So there is a place named Kובי, which is we can go into sort of the reputation of that place in the Bavli. But
Well, so that actually the sort of the geographical location, this town, it's really accounts for most of the mentions, right? 5 out of the 8 to 10 times that it gets mentioned, right? So there is this geographical town, which I don't know if it's far, but it's typically referenced in terms of sort of temporal / spatial reference to Pumbedita, or Pumbedisa, depending upon whatever. So so there's that. Or in one case from Bekuve to the fortress of Tulbakni, right? So there's this geographical reference as a place, as like maybe a town, but that's not really our interest, right?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting is as a place, and when it does show up, sort of this geographic sense, it seems, I think, to be sort of it's sort of the margins of civilization is how I sort of decided that its connotations were that it's not a place where sort of like of good law abiding people. It's more I think maybe it should be translated saloon. I don't know.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. I mean, it could be like a storage place for all these casks. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just some place. Although it'd be kind of an inconvenient. The sense of distance is it'd be sort of an inconvenient schlep to go for your supplies. I don't know.
I'm not saying this has any relationship to their reality. I'm just thinking about our present day reality. So I did a trip in May with my wife to Louisville, Kentucky. And while there, a lot of the distilleries don't really that's not where they age their bourbon. They actually age it in Bardstown, which is a distance away. So this is making me think about the distance between Louisville and Bardstown in Kentucky, where they would actually store all of these barrels, and that would be their Bay Cube, as it were. But that's a contemporary reference. Okay. But we have this particular institutional sort of description, right? And that's really the focus, and certainly the focus of what you wrote about in your research in this article. And it has something to do with dance too. So what have you found in your research, this usage insofar as it pertains to a particular institution?
Well, I guess in the handful of references we have to the slave Daru, he's one of the things that he is associated with is dancing at this Bay Kubi, Bay Kube, and so. It appears so, which makes me think that at least in some cases, it's probably not just a place where they aged things, but where actually activities took place.
I thought you were going to say they accessed what was inside of them.
Yes, and it led to frivolity.
Yes, people had good times.
Yes, and it's part of what leads to, the various accounts of, because Daru is the slave of Rav Nachman. And he sort of has this you get the sense that Rav Nachman was sort of indulgent, and that's why his slave was able to go off and sort of have a good time and have this sort of reputation. He shows up in passages where where there's a discussion about like the economics of slavery. Like they eat more than you get from them. In terms of
So can we make specific reference to those?
Yeah.
Okay, so for those less familiar, what Professor Lieber is referencing, so there's 2 primary instances where this slave is being referenced in relationship to Rav Nachman, right? Okay, and so for those less familiar with Rav Nachman, so he died about 320, so he lived around the turn of the going into the 4th century, and he lived in the generation before Rava, who's going to come up. And I think I've mentioned Rava on the show before, who was probably the most famous, huge wine drinker of the Talmud. And so Rav Nachman, but he was a moneyed person. He had a good deal of material ability, as it were. And we've also brought him up in the barrel smashing wine incident with Yalta. And it was a terribly sad incident. People can check out a previous episode on that topic where a lady named Yalta, potentially his wife, unclear the relationship between the two of them, but she smashed 400 things of his wine in his wine house, which was terrible. Although on the other hand, anybody who has 400 things of wine, they probably have more.
Yeah, Dara was he appears to be, I mean, even the fact that he's named, there aren't a lot of slaves with names.
Right.
So that makes him sort of distinctive figure, which gives him kind of a status. And he appears to be, just sort of the indulged slave of a very privileged house.
Hope you've been enjoying this episode so far featuring Professor Lieber. I wanted to give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Noam Sachs-Sion on Homa's Day in Court. Here we go, sneak peek.
Who knows Abaye or Nachmani better? Is it his wife or his chavruta, his study partner, his sparring partner?
Well, it's giving her the wine, not necessarily him drinking. It's giving her the wine.
Right.
So unless Rava was a frequent drinking partner of Abaye at his home, or double dating, how would he know?
Right. Is wine always in public or not? So,
especially a marital. I mean, maybe you could have wine drinking together in private.
Right. Now,
hope you enjoy that sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Noam Sachs-Sion. Now back into this episode with Professor Lieber. So there's two for anybody who wants to follow along at home. So anybody looking on YouTube. So it appears a couple places. So in Bava Kama 86a, so Rav Yosef Bar Chama says to, I don't remember who, but he says, I will say that Rav Nachman said this with regard to specific slaves, such as his slave Daru, who only dances among the wine barrels, this Bekuve, and does not perform any labor. So I don't know. That's a really cool slave to have. They don't do any labor. They just dance around wine. And then very similarly, Rava said to someone, I will say that Rav Nachman said this regard to specific slaves, such as his slave Dari, which is an interesting different print. I haven't looked at the manuscripts, the differences between Dari, Daru.
The general consensus is just, it's minor orthography. I think Taliban has a nice little bit on the name.
Oh, cool.
So,
I mean, it probably was a Vav. We missed some ink. Right. And then again, this slave, it's the same as the other one. He dances among the wine barrels and does not perform any other labor. So I don't know who. That's a really cool slave to have. Like he has so many slaves. Or servants. This one doesn't even actually do any work. He's got enough of those. This one is just dedicated for dancing among the wine barrels. But it sounds like it wasn't just actually. And can I throw something in also? Mm-hmm. We're still talking about Sasanian Persia. So Babylonia, they are a beer country. And so that's what's really, well, first of all, it's actually unclear. Is this necessarily wine? These could be beer barrels, right?
Yeah, I think they could be.
Okay, so there's an ambiguity there. But even if it were to be wine, because we do know that Rav Nachman did have copious amounts of wine, even just in that other incident with Yalta destroying so many of them, that I think that even shows his material abilities all the more so, that in a country of beer, he has so much wine.
So,
on top of having separate servants just to dance around them. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, just was he, serve the question whether he's serving at banquets says, that he's not just, that he's dancing, it's, Marquis de Bay Cuvée. So, he's in these warehouses or whatever, these storage, and he's dancing Marquis, which is not actually something that comes up a whole lot, and certainly not in sort of these contexts. And that was, part of what got my attention was I was used to looking at, there's dancing, there's sort of like licit dancing, like at weddings and other things. And then this is something else. This is clearly a little more tawdry or something, maybe just.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine any possibility in which there'd be totally like, I want to say sober dancing around a whole bunch of wine or beer, but I just can't imagine that.
Oh,
I mean, who knows? Maybe that there's something about, in sort of it, it's not the typical, not sobriety, but like there are certain societal standards of what people have conversations about, what is okay to say, when and where. But maybe at this Bekube, things are a little bit different. Things are a little bit looser, and it's okay to lighten up and to have some certain sense of frivolity going on.
So yeah, and I think, it's interesting that when we get to the Bekube as a place, that it's associated, the place where it's entirely slaves, which is a sense of the rules are a little different, and you get a sense of sort of the liberation of the constrained might be one way of thinking about it.
You're referencing Kedushin 70b, where Rav Yosef, and who is a contemporary of Rav Nachman, Rav Yosef says, with regard to this place called Beit Kuveh of Pumbedisa, its residents are all descendants of slaves, which is already an interesting thing that Beit Kuveh is in reference here to Pumbedisa, but maybe it's like a suburb or like a, it's slightly adjacent maybe, but and anyway, its residents are all descendants of slaves, which sounds really interesting also.
Yeah, so you get there's some places where dancing, sort of dancing and social status and social location of dancing. In the article, I'm just sort of trying to like take these different little threads that don't, it's sort of like they're like a couple of different ideas that I'm interested in. Each text will have like 2 out of 4, and I'm trying to sort of like weave them together and get a sense of what's going on, because you have, because we even have, finally, so there's the one text, the halakhic text, which doesn't mention Daru at all, but it talks about professional dancers, and I think, so we have this idea of the dancing as a profession, and so where you're liable if you, like, if you
injure them.
Yes, if you injure them by removing their ability to sort of express themselves, that you're liable. And one of the categories of injury is impairing someone's ability to communicate by dance. For a professional dancer, then you've harmed their livelihood. It's not just an aesthetic. It's not. It has to do with a depilatory cream and removing someone's hair. It's a strange passage to me, but I think it gets, it creates this sort of sense of like, that it was, that even, this people, the Beit Kuveh that was sort of the suburb that was entirely of former slaves, and the idea that maybe someone like Daru could have like earned money, like as a dancer, and that was could be a profession, or maybe just get extra tips or something.
So it sounds like he's like privately employed to be this dancer at this wine place, right?
Yeah.
Or beer. This place of presumably drinking.
Fermentation has taken place.
Yes. Well, it's unclear. I mean, it says he would lose his livelihood. Well, I guess, it makes sense. If he's no longer able to dance there, then why would Rav Nachman keep him in his employ, or, he'd be out on the streets, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we have one other cool text about this, and this one does involve the biggest drinker of the Talmud, Rava. It's interesting. He's a huge wine drinker, but at the same time, he's also one of absolutely the most influential rabbis of the entire Talmud, which is super duper fascinating. Before I get to what Rava says, just for some context for the listeners out there. So there is a Tannaitic text, a Breita, an early rabbinic text that says, any Torah scholar who feasts excessively everywhere degrades himself and brings suffering upon himself. Yikes. He will ultimately destroy his house, widow his wife, orphan his children, and his studies will be forgotten. Much dispute will come upon him. His words will not be heeded, and he will desecrate God's name and the name of his master and the name of his father. And if that wasn't enough, and he will cause a bad name for himself, his children, and his descendants throughout future generations. they were not happy with this. But with the riffing off of what is this causing a bad name for himself, as if all this other stuff really wasn't bad enough. It was just like ratcheting up the rhetoric with one line after another. But what is this causing a bad name for himself? So Rava, which is really fascinating because Rava, we know, is a big wine drinker. He said his son will be called the son of the one who dances at Beit Kuveh, at these barrel houses, as he seems to be invited to every feast to entertain the guests. There's a lot there to unpack for Rava. So I just want to point out, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Professor Lieber, but for me, it's this invited to every feast to entertain the guests. Like, it's not like he's already a Talmud Chacham. He's already a scholar, a learned person. He's going there to enjoy himself, and being invited to all of them is great. but why are they inviting him? Well, he's going to be a fun guy and he's going to entertain the guests. It's like, so it seems that Rava's not keen on, okay, so he's going around, he's doing all this drinking, and eating, and I guess he makes a fool out of himself.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like it's like a, a party boy. It's
right, and not just someone who's just like going to hang out, but like who's entertaining also.
Yeah, he is. It's like he comes, but he is the entertainment.
Yes. At least the way Rava positions it. I mean, it's not clear from the early rabbinic text he's riffing off of, but certainly here, I mean, it could be from that Baraita, that early rabbinic text, simply that, it's not good that he spends all this time partying, eating, drinking, celebrating all this time to every single one. But in Rava's riff off of this, it's, well, because you're kind of making a fool out of yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, in the essay I draw on some parallel material that actually like the depictions of David. There's a midrash that talks about Michal seeing David, through the window, and she sees him dancing, and ways of David sort of the same thing. I mean, he's a great figure, but he embarrasses himself in this. This is the rabbis say that that he's not. It's not religiously sort of restrained dancing or something.
Oh, right.
He's really like stomping his feet and spinning around, and they clearly side with Michal, who finds it just kind of embarrassing.
Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. Whether if you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also, please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode. What other insights had, in the course of your research and your findings, what other insights about the dancing, about socioeconomic status that you wanted? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I do find it interesting that sort of that in some ways the text that I pulled together on this topic, you get a sense of, Daru having, sort of like, I mean, it's not really a fully developed personality, but he is having the fun in the house, it seems like, and that in some ways it seems like his fun brings pleasure to Rav Nachman. I mean, that's why you would have him. That it is that entertainment, which would be unseemly perhaps if it were a member of the rabbinic circle, but for this, it's acceptable for the slave. Which, I mean, that does certainly align with what we know about sort of performance and class structure, certainly in the Roman context from the same time period.
Oh, really?
And sort of like, and sort of the traditional sort of like actors and as being sort of it's sort of a sketchy profession, but a sense that they're having a lot of fun.
Well, it's kind of at the periphery of acceptability, certainly for rabbinic acceptability, and it's not certainly Rava's not keen on scholar sages to be doing this, but if you outsource it to a slave or someone of perhaps a lower socioeconomic status, that's okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And so. Yes, I think there's, and so we see that, and there's a one passage I find where Rav Nachman actually, it's at the Passover Seder, so there Daru is serving the wine, presumably. He's and there's this whole the question about the shamefulness of slavery is one of the passages that he talks about. And he actually asks Daru the movri from slavery to freedom, and it's sort of. There's a part of me that thinks it's a little tone deaf for Rav Nachman to be asking Daru about this, because he is still,
he's still a slave.
But
it's like a major tease to Daru.
Yeah. So you sort of sense like maybe after he does some extra passionate dancing that he work it out.
Right.
But because you do have, I mean, it's a moment where you sort of realize that that there is reality of class difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, even being a privileged slave, who has a name and other things, and we don't know. And one of the things that's clear, we can't tell, is he, does he, his ethnic identity or anything. We don't really know.
Right.
And his name, is it a short form of Darius? That's where Halilon's work on naming customs is interesting.
Oh wow.
She identifies in this Jew question mark.
Questionably Jewish.
Yes, but even sort of like what would that mean? And the question that's the idea that slaves are sort of, that they sort of mix more freely. And I think you almost get a sense of sort of that there's an attraction almost, I think, is sort of like a fascination with sort of the different lifestyle, in this Bay Koubi where it's a city that, it's entirely slaves, and sort of the difference. It's sort of like it's almost like the after party.
So, I mean, it's kind of now. I don't even know what to think now. Is it like the suburb? Is that where people go to hang out? Is this like a special little Vegas? I don't know what. I'm actually kind of confused. Like maybe it is a special place that is the suburb of Pumbedita. Is that a possibility?
Well, we actually do know that there would be enclaves where people like manumitted slaves or other groups would in fact, sort of set up, sort of neighborhoods together. Oh. So it's possible that this could refer to a real phenomenon as opposed to something sort of more metaphorical, which is sort of interesting to think about. Like at what point does because on the one hand, sort of like the Bay Koubi sort of it's an interesting just sort of construct to sort of think about. Sort of this as a place where the rules are different. It's like Cheers, or everybody knows your name, and or the idea, but at the same time, the knowing that in the Persian Empire, that freed slaves would just sort of form these neighborhoods, and so it could be just reflecting a familiar reality.
Yeah. Wow. We don't know much more about it. We're only getting these snippets.
Yeah, and I mean, part of what made the piece sort of an interesting challenge for me was it was sort of a reminder of how much we still don't know, I think, about these sorts of aspects of life in Sasanian Persia. And there are some really, interesting, sort of visual depictions of dancing and other things, but in terms of like literary sources that I was able to find and access, there just wasn't a lot about these topics. It may be out there and I just didn't have access.
Yeah.
But I did try.
Yes. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much. This is really neat to shed some light on this. Certainly it's not well known. I think we can all agree on that.
So
yes.
Yeah, it's a funny little sort of selection of texts to pull together. And it's one of those passages where, being someone who's not, I'm not, sort of by training sort of someone who works, particularly in Talmud, to sort of in a way find that there are these still passages that haven't been so thoroughly mined, and that we're still, it's wonderful.
We're still discovering new insights.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Well, Professor Lieber, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this really fascinating topic. And so thank you.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
Thank you. Do you have anything you want to promote or otherwise share that you've got going on?
Just keep your eyes open for a forthcoming book on theatricality and performance in Jewish late antiquity.
Ooh, okay. That is very enticing. Awesome. Okay. Well, Professor Lieber, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And l'chaim.
L'chaim.